In 30 years on this bench, a United States Senator has never walked into my courtroom, called me by my first name, and told me calmly, pleasantly, like he was recommending a restaurant, that my career was something he could end with a phone call. That happened on a Monday morning in November, and before that morning was over, he left my courtroom in handcuffs. If you believe the law means what it says, that it applies to every single person who walks through that door, regardless of their title or their net worth, then stay with me. Subscribe right now, because I tell these stories every week, and this one is unlike anything I have ever described from this seat. I walked into that courtroom at 8:50 a.m., coffee in hand, ready for the usual organized chaos. Attorneys conferring in corners, families filling the gallery rows, the low hum of a room full of people with problems they're hoping someone can solve. But the moment I stepped through the door, I knew something was wrong. The room was silent, completely, unnervingly silent. The kind of silence that tells you something has already happened before you arrived. I looked at my clerk, Michael. He was standing instead of sitting, which he never does, and his face had gone the color of chalk. He didn't say good morning. He didn't hand me the files. He simply looked toward the gallery and said very quietly, "Judge, front row." I put my glasses on and looked up. Sitting in the public gallery, right where ordinary people sit, where families and witnesses and court watchers sit, was a man in a dark navy suit that had not been purchased anywhere in this city, an American flag pin on his lapel, 2 aides behind him, a personal attorney arranged beside him like furniture. He was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided how the morning ends. It was Senator Victor Caldwell, 3 terms in office, presidential ambitions well known to anyone who read a newspaper, the kind of political capital that makes staffers lower their voices when his name comes up. And he was staring at my bench like a man who had come to collect something that belonged to him. I looked down at the docket. The name on the file read, Natalie Caldwell, age 26, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, fleeing the scene of an accident, his daughter. What he did not know, what he was about to find out, was that he had walked into the wrong courtroom. I called the session to order. The bailiff announced the case. I looked toward the prosecutor's table, ready to begin. Senator Caldwell stood up. He did not raise his hand. He did not ask to be recognized. He did not do any of the things that every other human being in that room understood were required of them the moment they walked through those doors. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket with the unhurried ease of a man adjusting before a board meeting, and walked through the swinging gate into the well of my courtroom, the space that belongs to attorneys, defendants, and officers of the court, and to no one else without my permission. My bailiff took a step forward. I held up one finger. I wanted to hear this. The senator stopped in front of my bench and looked up at me with a smile I can only describe as patient. The smile of someone accustomed to people understanding things without needing to be told twice. He clasped his hands in front of him. "Your Honor," he said, except the way he said it made it sound like anything but technically correct, completely hollow, the kind of courtesy that is really just condescension wearing a tie. "This case," he said, "is a politically motivated mischaracterization of a minor traffic incident involving my daughter. I think we both know that." He paused. "I sit on the Federal Judiciary Oversight Committee, and I have a genuine interest in seeing that the resources of this court are directed toward matters that actually warrant them." The smile didn't shift. "I would simply encourage you to consider the implications of how this morning proceeds for everyone involved." He said it pleasantly, calmly, no raised voice, no pointed finger, just the smooth, steady pressure of a man who has spent 3 terms in office, learning that the most effective threats are the ones that don't sound like threats at all. I took my glasses off. I set them on the bench in front of me, deliberately, carefully, the way I do when I need every person in the room to understand that what comes next will not be negotiated. The gallery did not make a sound. "Senator Caldwell," I said, "you will return behind the bar immediately, or I will have you removed." He held my gaze for a moment longer than was wise. Then he turned and walked back to the front row with the deliberate calm of a man who had decided to try a different approach. He sat down, crossed one leg over the other. He was not finished. Neither was I. "Mr. Webb," I said, "please proceed." Marcus Webb stood up from the prosecutor's table. He was 28 years old, 8 months into his first prosecutorial position. He had prepared thoroughly for this case. He had not prepared for the senator sitting 12 feet behind him. And the difference between those two things was written plainly across his face. His hands holding his notes were not entirely steady, but he stood up. I want to say that clearly. He stood up anyway. "Your Honor," he began, his voice finding its footing as he went. "On Saturday, November 9th, at approximately 11:20 in the morning, the defendant, Natalie Caldwell, drove a 2023 Range Rover into the pedestrian zone of the city's weekly farmers market on Clement Street. She was traveling at a speed later estimated by 2 independent witnesses at between 35 and 40 miles per hour in a zone where no vehicle traffic is permitted." He paused. "4 people were injured. 1 required hospitalization for a broken wrist. 2 others sustained lacerations." He paused again. "The 4th was Dorothy Okafor." I looked toward the gallery. Dorothy was sitting in the 3rd row, 71 years old, arm in a sling, her cheek still carrying the faint yellowed shadow of a fracture that had not fully healed. She was sitting straight. She was watching Marcus Webb with the patient attention of someone who has waited a long time to hear her name said in a room like this. "Ms. Okafor is a retired school teacher," Marcus continued. "Every Saturday, without exception, she sets up a table of homemade preserves and baked goods, items she begins preparing the previous Tuesday." He set his notes down. "Her entire display was destroyed in the collision. 6 months of work gone in seconds." He looked up. When Ms. Okafor approached the vehicle, not in anger, Your Honor, but out of concern, the defendant exited the car. She was screaming that the vendors had no business being in the road. His voice stayed level. When Ms. Okafor attempted to respond, the defendant struck her across the face with an open hand. The room was very still. Ms. Okafor suffered a fractured cheekbone and a torn rotator cuff from the fall that followed. She spent 4 days in the hospital. He paused one final time. A bystander recorded 15 seconds of footage, Your Honor. It leaves no room for interpretation. I looked at Dorothy Okafor. She was still sitting straight. Across the room at the defense table, Natalie Caldwell had not looked up from her phone. That told me everything I needed to know about what the rest of this morning was going to require. I had been watching Natalie Caldwell since the moment Marcus began speaking. What I observed was this: nothing, not a flinch at Dorothy's name, not a shift in posture when the fracture was described, not a flicker of anything when Marcus said 4 days in the hospital. She sat at the defense table in a jacket tailored specifically to fit her, surrounded by 4 attorneys, not public defenders, not local counsel, but specialists who bill in increments that most people in this city will never earn in a month. They were arranged around her like a perimeter. 2 of them were watching the senator in the front row with the alert, calibrated attention of people waiting for a signal. I noted all of it. Gerald Ferris, the lead defense attorney, was on his feet before Natalie had drawn breath to enter a plea. Not guilty. And before I could respond, he pivoted immediately into a motion to suppress the bystander footage, consent issues, chain of custody, the full toolkit of a man whose client's problems have a consistent habit of disappearing before trial. Natalie did not look up from her phone during any of it. I looked past Ferris at his client. Then I looked at Dorothy Okafor in the 3rd row, watching the defense table with the quiet, undemanding attention of a woman who has simply come here to find out whether this room is what it claims to be. I picked up my pen. We were going to find out. I called a 30-minute recess at 10:15 to review the suppression motion. Standard procedure. I expected to return to a room in roughly the same condition I had left it. What I did not expect was Marcus Webb's face when he walked back through that door. I have spent 30 years learning what a prosecutor looks like when he has been shaken by the facts of a case. That was not what I was seeing. This was the face of someone who had just been asked to make a decision he had not expected to face today, and who was still in the process of making it. He sat down, arranged his papers, did not look at me. I watched him for a moment. Then I leaned into the microphone. Mr. Webb, during the recess, did anyone approach you regarding this case? The courtroom, which had been settling back into its seats, went still again. Marcus Webb looked at me. He looked at his papers. He looked at Senator Caldwell in the front row, whose expression had gone carefully, deliberately neutral. The kind of neutral that requires effort. 4 seconds passed. I counted them. In 30 years, I have learned that 4 seconds of silence from a prosecutor is not nothing. 4 seconds is a decision being made in real time. Then Marcus Webb straightened in his chair, looked directly at me and said, "Yes, Your Honor." Senator Caldwell approached me in the corridor outside the records office during the recess. He indicated that if I were to recommend dismissal of the current charges, he could ensure that an unrelated matter currently under review by his office would be handled with, in his words, prosecutorial discretion. He paused. 3 people were present in that corridor. I have their names. Nobody in that room moved. I looked at Senator Caldwell. He uncrossed his legs. For the first time since he had walked through my door that morning, the smile was gone. I took my glasses off. I set my pen down. I folded my hands on the bench and looked at Senator Victor Caldwell with the complete, unhurried stillness that I reserve for moments when everything that follows is already decided. When the only remaining question is how long it takes everyone else in the room to understand it. What Marcus Webb had just described, on the record, in open session, with 3 named witnesses, was not ambiguous. It was attempted bribery of a prosecuting attorney during active court proceedings on courthouse property in a case currently before this bench. There is no version of those facts that requires deliberation. There is only one thing a judge does when those facts land on the record. I looked at my bailiff, Officer Reyes. He was already watching me. "Senator Caldwell," I said. My voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "What Mr. Webb has described before this court constitutes attempted bribery of a court officer and obstruction of justice. It occurred on courthouse property during active proceedings. It has been reported by the prosecutor himself and corroborated by 3 witnesses." 1 pause. "Officer Reyes." Reyes moved. The senator's 2 aides stepped back, not toward him, away from him, with the involuntary instinct of people who have just calculated their own exposure and decided that distance is the appropriate response. His personal attorney opened his mouth, produced no sound, and closed it again. Gerald Ferris at the defense table went very still. The senator stood as the handcuffs closed. I will say this for him. He stood straight, but straightness is not dignity when the handcuffs are real. And every person in that gallery knew the difference. Officer Reyes walked him toward the door. The senator did not speak. He did not look at his daughter. He looked straight ahead with the expression of a man who had walked into this room as the most powerful person in it and was now leaving in a way he had not once considered possible. The doors opened. Every face in that gallery turned toward him, not with noise, with something colder and more final than noise. Every face in that room watched him go, and not one of them looked away. When the doors closed, the defense table came apart. Not loudly. Ferris was too professional for loud, but visibly, the way structures come apart when the load-bearing element is suddenly removed. The junior attorneys looked the way junior attorneys look when the case they flew in to manage has become something no one briefed them for. And Natalie Caldwell, for the first time since she had taken her seat that morning, looked up from her phone. She was staring at the doors her father had just been walked through. Her face held the expression of someone who has just discovered that the floor they have been standing on their entire life is not floor at all. I did not give the defense table time to regroup. Miss Caldwell, I am denying bail. You have the financial resources and the international connections to constitute a demonstrated flight risk, and the events of this morning have given this court no reason to extend good faith on that question. I am also ordering your passport seized pending the conclusion of these proceedings. That was when Natalie began to cry. Not quietly, not with the restrained honesty of someone genuinely sorry for what they had done to another person. These were panicked, disbelieving tears. The tears of someone who has never had to sit with a real consequence and has just been informed that sitting with this one is not optional. I watched her for a moment. Miss Caldwell, I said, you are not crying for Dorothy Okafor. You are crying for yourself. This court knows the difference. By the time I was ready to deliver the verdict, Natalie's crying had subsided into silence. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of exhaustion, of a person who has run out of performances and has nothing left to put in their place. Gerald Ferris sat beside her with his hands folded on the table, a man who had arrived this morning with a full strategy and was now simply present, which was, honestly, the most genuine thing he had done all day. I straightened the file, put my glasses back on. Natalie Caldwell, I find you guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, fleeing the scene of an accident. I looked at her directly. You will serve 2 years in a state correctional facility. Upon release, you will complete 400 hours of community service, assigned specifically to food banks and community markets. The kinds of places and the kinds of people that you drove through on a Saturday morning without slowing down. She swallowed. You will undergo mandatory psychological evaluation because consequences without understanding produce nothing durable. You will compose, by hand and without attorney assistance, a formal letter of apology to Dorothy Okafor. You will read it aloud in this courtroom before you are remanded today. I paused. You will also record an unscripted video statement. No preparation, no legal coaching, no second takes. Full and personal responsibility, in your own words. That statement will be broadcast across your father's official public platforms and your own social media. The public that watched 15 seconds of footage deserves to hear the full accounting directly from you. Natalie stared at the table. Marcus Webb rose from the prosecutor's table. His voice was steady and clear, the voice of someone who had been tested this morning in ways his training did not cover and had passed anyway. Then Dorothy Okafor stood up. She rose slowly, arm in its sling, and walked to the center of the room with the unhurried dignity that had been hers from the moment she first sat down. She looked at me. She did not ask for anything more. She did not enumerate what had been taken from her or demand that the record reflect her suffering in greater detail. She simply said 3 words. She saw me. I looked at Dorothy Okafor, 71 years old, retired school teacher, fractured cheekbone, 4 days in a hospital, 6 months of work destroyed on a Saturday morning. You were always visible, Miss Okafor, I said. This room simply made it official. The gavel came down, and for the first time all morning, the silence that followed felt like something had been restored rather than something lost. The story did not end when the gavel came down. In some ways, it was only beginning. 4 people in that gallery had their phones out when Officer Reyes walked the senator through those doors. 4 separate angles, 4 simultaneous uploads. By the time I had signed the remand order and called the session closed, the footage was already moving faster than anyone in his office could contain. 18 million views before midnight. Every major network carried it by morning. The image of a 3-term senator, dark navy suit, American flag pins still on his lapel, being walked out of a courtroom in handcuffs, became the kind of image people reference for years when they're trying to explain what accountability looks like when it arrives without warning. The FBI opened a formal investigation within 48 hours. What they found took 11 months to fully document. A decade of judicial interference, campaign finance fraud, 14 suppressed police reports involving members of the senator's family and their associates. Reports buried so thoroughly that several of the officers who filed them had long assumed they were simply lost. Senator Caldwell was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. He resigned his seat from custody in a letter his attorney released on his behalf. It contained no apology. It did not mention Dorothy Okafor by name. Natalie Caldwell served her sentence. She completed her community service hours at 2 food banks and at 1 farmer's market, the same Saturday market on Clement Street where Dorothy Okafor sells her preserves every weekend. They did not become friends, but they became something. 2 women who share a single morning that altered both of their lives, working out in their own time and in their own way the long, unglamorous distance between damage and repair. Dorothy received over $400,000 in public donations within 72 hours of the footage going viral. She did not retire. She expanded. She named her new permanent stall after the morning she walked to the center of a courtroom and refused to ask for anything except to be seen. Marcus Webb was offered a senior prosecutor position before the year was out. He took it without hesitation. As for me, at 11:14 that morning, I looked at my clerk Michael and said, "Call the next case." It was a parking violation. A confused elderly gentleman who had misread the sign. I waived the fine, wished him a good afternoon, and moved on. The law does not stop for senators. It certainly does not stop for me. I have thought about that morning many times since the gavel came down, and I think something needs to be said plainly. This story is not about hating the powerful. It is not about politics or party or which side of any aisle you stand on. It is about something much simpler and much more important than any of that. It is about one question: is this bench real? Does it mean what it says it means? Is the law that applies to the confused elderly man with the parking ticket genuinely the same law that applies to the senator in the Navy suit with a flag pin? That morning in this room, the answer was yes. It has to always be yes. The moment it becomes conditional, the moment we start deciding that certain titles make certain people exempt, we stop being a court. We become something else entirely, something that serves power instead of checking it. Dorothy Okafor walked to the center of this room and said 3 words: "She saw me." That is what this bench is for. Not for the senator, not for the designer-suited attorneys, or the aides who stepped backward when the handcuffs came out. For Dorothy, for the teacher crossing the street, for the vendor at the Saturday market setting up her display since the previous Tuesday, for every person who walks through that door, hoping that the room they are entering is exactly what it claims to be. I have sat in this chair for more than 30 years. I will be here tomorrow, and the law, the real law, will be here with me. Nobody is above it, not in this courtroom. If this story moved you, if it made you believe even for a moment that justice is still worth defending, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel, because I have 30 years of stories from this bench, and every single one of them is about ordinary people who deserved to be seen. That is why I keep telling them.